The ACLU is challenging the Biden-Harris administration to stay true to its promise for advancing racial equity. The nonpartisan organization continues its decades-long fight to protect the rights of all Americans by launching an initiative called Systemic Equality. The agenda seeks to push lawmakers to address racism through policy. Rakim Brooks is the Systemic Equality Campaign Manager for the ACLU, and he's joining us now from Washington to discuss. Rakim, thanks so much for joining us on this today. I want to start with a question that you address in your article available at the ACLU called "To End Systemic Racism, Ensure Systemic Equality." What is systemic racism?
Systemic racism is essentially what you might call the sediments of historic racism, which is to say, we take slavery, Jim Crow, contemporary mass incarceration, and it creates an edifice that ultimately disadvantages people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people. And so you might think, for example, take something like redlining or housing discrimination more generally that my grandparents experienced and plenty of people's grandparents experienced. Well, those redlining policies led to a disaccumulation of wealth for Black Americans that reverberates today into things like subprime mortgages and a lack of access to the best financial instruments that would allow one to make themselves whole. What I like to say is that the American dream costs more for Black Americans, in part because of systemic racism.
So systemic equality, as you write at the ACLU, is a systemic solution. I want to go through step by step on the solutions that you're calling on the Biden administration and legislators to implement. Let's start with voting rights here. What specifically are you calling on the administration to do?
Well, you might know that last year we had the highest voter turnout in American history, and that for most people would be a good thing. But it seems that many state legislatures, I think over 28, are introducing over 106 bills to attempt to limit the access to the ballot. And so we are calling on the Biden administration to first work with Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And in addition, to work internally to make sure that there might be a U.S. attorney in every U.S. attorney's office who's dedicated to voting rights.
One thing on this agenda that really struck me was access to broadband. Perhaps some people take it for granted in this country, but the fact of the matter is broadband access is not something that is widespread in the United States. As you point out, 15% of American households with school-aged children do not have subscriptions to any form of broadband, including 1/4 of Black households. It's something that's come under the lens, certainly during the COVID pandemic, when we've learned that so many students around the country are not able to access school remotely. What can lawmakers do to ensure broadband access, and how does this fit into systemic equality?
Sure. We believe that Congress is currently moving in the right direction by attempting to expand the emergency broadband benefit so that more children will have access to high-speed internet at home and in libraries. As you just said, many people, almost all students, so far as I can tell, in the areas that I live in, are working from home at the moment, studying from home, and many of them lack access, particularly Black children lack access. Some are relying exclusively on a smartphone in order to do their work. And so that's the first step that Congress can take. But we've seen many new innovations. We'll be sort of watching closely to see which we would support most heavily to expand broadband access across the country. But this seems like the year to do it. Broadband access sort of universally might cost $100 billion. We're talking about stimulus packages in the order of trillions of dollars. So I think Congress can get this done this year.
And finally, what about when it comes to reparations? What are you calling on the Biden administration and lawmakers to do when it comes to exploring reparations?
Presently, to pass H.R. 40. H.R. 40 is a commission to study reparations on behalf of Black Americans. And it seems a sensible and a solution whose time has really come. It's time for this country, after the uprisings of last year and the murder of George Floyd and our increased focus on police brutality, to really account not just for slavery, but for Jim Crow and mass incarceration, to consider fully what might be owed to Black Americans as a way of reconciling that history. And that's really the important point. We're stressing reconciliation. We don't believe that this country can get past its racial past in the racial horrors, the horrors of racism without this legislation.
How did this change over the last 4 years with President Trump in office? Because you and your colleague Ranika Moore, you open up your article about this, talking about the last 4 years and things that Trump has said to Democrats, to Americans.
Yes, well, we think, of course, that systemic racism, because it is systemic, has existed prior to Donald Trump, but in many ways, he opened Pandora's box. He revealed to us the depths of American racism in a way that, frankly, my generation hadn't encountered, and in quite the same way, and that we thought had been left to our forebears. Police brutality is, of course, something that our generation has lived with, but the kind of rank, blatant racism from public officials, from leading public officials, was something that I don't think anyone expected after 8 years of the first Black president.
You're under new leadership with Deborah Archer as the first Black woman to lead the ACLU in more than a century of its existence. How do you see what she plans to do as perhaps taking the ACLU in a different direction?
We couldn't be more excited to have Deborah become the new board president. I don't know that she'll be taking us in a different direction. As she likes to say, we'll continue our commitments to the First Amendment, but we're going to deepen our commitments to the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. And as a leading expert on racial justice through her center at NYU, I think she's the perfect person to take us forward in that journey.
Rakim Brooks, ACLU Systemic Equality Campaign Manager. Thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quicktake now for insight in an instant.